Welcome back. Well, the time has come for us to see what stories made the headlines in our weekend newspapers. And for this, we are joined by the eNCA's Erin Bates. Erin, thank you so much for making the time. You've had a very busy week, of course. There's a lot going on the newspapers. We'll come to the state's plan to trim government down, but you've been covering some really interesting stories for us. Take us through some of the stuff that's going to be making headline news this week.
So Feki Mento will be back at the Zondo Commission on Monday, and this is going to be the first instance of cross-examination at the inquiry, which is critical for testing the evidence that people have given under oath. A lot of people have considered this a whitewash process, and up until now it rather has been, because nothing's really been quibbled. And so she, being one of arguably the weaker witnesses, is now going to have to face heat from counsel for the likes of Duduzane Zuma.
Okay, who will cross-examine her?
So counsel for Duduzane Zuma is definitely set down to cross-examine her.
Who is that?
I can't remember his name offhand, but I think it was Advocate Mike Helens, who was representing Duduzane Zuma and has not only in sort of commercial crimes-based matters, but also his culpable homicide case. But then Fana Hlongwane is an interesting case because she had initially implicated him, saying that she'd met Fana Hlongwane and Duduzane Zuma on a plane that was going from Dubai to China for a state visit, and then retracted that in November. So she wrote a letter to the Commission to say that, in fact, she was possibly mistaken about Fana Hlongwane being on that plane, and she wanted to remove his mention. And bear in mind that she'd also gotten Fana Hlongwane and Brian Hlongwa confused between her book and her oral testimony. So things are a bit of a hot mess when it comes to Feki Mento's testimony and the finer details in terms of the facts.
But one of the things that that came out this week, of course, was the fact that former President Jacob Zuma was front and center involved in the Bosasa, capture of various governments and ministries. Take us through why the testimony of some of the people puts President Zuma right in the middle of this Bosasa scandal.
Well, what is interesting is that in a way they've kind of skirted around Zuma to some extent, and that's where page 7 of the Sunday Times is so critical and alarming. I think that it's not page 1 of the Sunday Times, but Iqbal Survé is also keeping them busy. But here we have an article about an audio recording from November of 2017 in which Johannes Gumede of Bosasa, one of the directors, says that both he and Gavin Watson met with the old man. And Sunday Times is inferring from that they're talking about the former president, and during that discussion they disclose sort of confidential information from the Hawks and the NPA. And again, journalist Adrian Basson comes up because one of the members at this November 27 meeting says that Adrian Basson is a problem and Gerinel is a problem if the prosecution against Bosasa is revived. And so now, squarely on that audio evidence, we have the former president implicated again quite directly, because with the money, they sort of said it went to the foundation, maybe it wasn't directly going to Zuma. How do you prove that he was definitely getting it, and the like? And I think probably the closest we got to him was Dudu Myeni, her Louis Vuitton bag, allegedly, and the 300K that was supposedly inside it.
And of course, Adrian Basson's testimony that he was actually threatened by her and by others. So this does actually close the link between Dudu Myeni and President Zuma, because they admit at this meeting, according to this audio, that he is a problem.
Yes, so Adrian Basson didn't say that Dudu Myeni had threatened him. He said that there were other people linked to Bosasa, including a spin doctor who was a former journalist, actually worked at eNCA at one point in a number of radio stations. But he did speak quite sort of distinctly about threats. So had Dennis Blum, who spoke about the kind of threats he was subject to when he was sitting in Parliament and talking about Winnie Ngwenya saying, Kenyuku, there's money to be made if you'll meet the Bosasa executives. But this audio is not, obviously you can't listen to it through the paper, but if you go to the Times Live website, you can hear the audio, and it's pretty galling hearing, an executive of this company that's been so severely implicated in state capture saying, we met with the old man, we got confidential information.
What's interesting about the story is that the further quote shows how accurate it is, because it says the guys, this is one of, I think this is Gumede talking, he says, the guys from the Hawks even showed us, every Monday they have a meeting to discuss all these things. That's confidential information. And in that meeting they showed us that the only guys they wanted to charge were Angela and Patrick, and that's exactly what they've now gone and done.
Yeah, Angelo and Patrick and a slew of others, including Linda MT, who was rather upset when I asked him, did Bosasa corrupt you, and is Gavin Watson a corrupter? This was as he was walking out of the Pretoria Central Court into a Hawks vehicle. He turned almost as if to try and answer and seemed a little bit sort of rankled by the whole thing. And then later, as he was coming out of the Commercial Crimes Court, said to me, I have lost all respect for you, don't ask me stupid questions. But I think those are rather pertinent questions. You know, is Gavin Watson a corrupter, and did Bosasa corrupt the former Commissioner of Correctional Services?
Absolutely. Let's get to the front pages of the City Press and the Sunday Times. The City Press talks about the fact that Cyril is going to trim the fat. Now, we know, of course, the President promised us in his very first State of the Nation address that he's going to go to every single department, look at where the fat must be trimmed. And some people are talking about doing away with deputy ministers and, of course, combining a series of ministers like in the economics cluster and so on. How soon do you think, Erin, we are going to see, this lean, mean cabinet that the President is talking about?
Well, I think it's a bit of a delicate balancing act because, of course, there is a national election coming up and he's still dealing with a rather fractured governing party. And so it's likely that he's going to be fairly prudent about snipping any of that fat until he has a more consolidated sort of ring around him within the ANC. And in fact, Kusela Diko, who's quoted in this from the presidency side, is a bit vague on exactly the numbers and when they're going to do it. So, as much as he's forecasting that potential decision, I don't think it's going to happen any time before May.
Peter, do you think we need deputy ministers?
Well, in some departments, maybe, but in others, it's not really necessary. I mean, they should have real jobs in Parliament or wherever, under the British system, they don't have deputy ministers, but some ministers do have secretaries around them.
Do you foresee the possibility that if they merge departments, that you could well have maybe more than one Director General then?
No, but what would be really nice would be to see a ADG chosen to be the head of the civil service, so that between he and the President, whoever the President may be, and he or she as head of the civil service, they organise people's careers in the civil service, because it can be a mind-numbing thing when some minister comes in, decides she doesn't like your face, and you're out before you know it. It's not fair, and it doesn't promote decent bureaucracy,
A civil service,
What we do have here, these ministers employ a lot of people. I mean, the Sunday Times is saying ministers are allowed to employ between 6 and 10 staff, deputies are allowed 2. Many ministers have exceeded the limit. This is not only their cars and their houses in Cape Town and Pretoria. It's a very expensive business. He could save a lot of money. What he has to be careful of is creating sort of kind of super ministers who then, if a Brian Patel now does DTI, the economic planning, and you could throw in tourism into that as well, because it's an export. You begin to create real sort of pockets of power, and there's a real case for depoliticizing the cops and justice, and put it all under Home Affairs.
Okay, let's go to the Sunday Times headline. Surveys, 4.3 billion rand piggy bank. Now, of course, this is a story that's been brewing and coming for a very long time.
As they say in Mauritius, apparently. Ayo.
So, take us through the Sunday Times treatment of the story. Surveys, of course, denounced all of this, says that he released, in fact, a statement saying that they welcomed the statement, or rather the investigation into AO. But what does this tell us about the way in which the PIC made decisions and the centrality of Dan Machila in making these decisions?
Yeah. Well, what is interesting about the Sunday Times article is it speaks to a kind of centralization of power. So sort of fairly sort of toward the end of the article, we have 2 executives from IO saying that although they'd been senior executives, they actually had no power, and every decision had to be ratified here by the Chief Investment Officer, Malek Sali. And you get a real sense of the kind of control that people like Iqbal Survé and those close to him had within this, and also that it's Africa's largest asset manager, that you have an institution that is so involved in other parts of, investment and also government, now on the front page of the Sunday Times. I sort of think they should have gone with the Zuma article on the front page, just because, we're going to hear more at the state capture inquiry next week, and the Bosasa stuff is so galling. But obviously the PIC stuff and Iqbal Survé's company are also very important.
Look, this is a strong story. This
is
a very strong Iqbal Survé story. That's, I think, the strongest they've had in this long saga. I would have led.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, I know it's a tough call, but I think they got it right. What there hasn't been enough of is the fact that somebody's found 1 trillion barrels of oil off George.
Yes.
You know, we're going to become an oil state. I mean, we talk about corruption now. Can you just imagine? Can you imagine this country if we were an oil producer?
Oh, my goodness. Well, in some cases, they say, you know, opportunities also leads to crisis and the other way around. Erin Bates, thank you so very much for coming in. Well, you've had your fix for the week. Take care. We'll see you again next time, same time.